Your patience. We wanted to make sure that anyone who arrived a little bit late had time to get through the registration line. I'm sure a few of you saw its size. So now that we've hopefully got everyone here who's planning on attending and at least promptly, we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 32nd Annual Illinois State Conference. My name is Jeff, and I am an alcoholic.
Hi, Jeff.
Currently, our pre-registration stands at 593 attendees. We would like to thank all of you for supporting this year's conference. We have just a few conference-related announcements, just very simple ones, because obviously we're kicking off this morning. Hopefully everyone has had a chance to register, as well as to note that the volunteer tables are set up front, so if you have volunteered for any events to be a greeter or otherwise at any events, all of those information is up front. There'll be flyers available for other AA-related activities up front as well. The committee requests that all cell phones, beepers, and other electronic devices be turned off at this time. So anything that could interrupt our day today, please make sure it's set on vibrate or otherwise won't disturb us. I would like to remind everyone that given the length of time we'll be in the room today, and I will get in just a second into our schedule, feel free to, if you need to get up and stretch your legs or grab coffee or whatever else, please feel free to do so. However, again, just out of respect for the speakers, I'd ask that if you want to have any side conversations, we do those out in the hall. This is an open meeting of Alcoholics Anonymous. However, the single most important aspect of AA recovery is the principle of one alcoholic relating to another alcoholic. Therefore, only alcoholics participate at this meeting. If your problem is other than alcohol, we encourage you to pursue another 12-step program related to your problem. Alcoholics Anonymous is a fellowship of men and women who share their experience, strength, and hope with each other that they may solve their common problem and help others to recover from alcoholism. The only requirement for membership is a desire to stop drinking. There are no dues or fees for AA membership. We are self-supporting through our own contributions. AA is not allied with any sect, denomination, politics, organization, or institution, does not wish to engage in any controversy, neither endorses nor opposes any causes. Our primary purpose is to stay sober and help other alcoholics to achieve sobriety. The heart of our program is contained in a portion of Chapter 5 of the Big Book of Alcoholics Anonymous. I have asked Don B. to read this.
My name's Don Bennett, and I'm an alcoholic. My home group is a Wednesday night beginners big book meeting in Midlothian. I've been sober since February 9th, 1981. For that, I'm extremely grateful. Jeff asked me to read chapter 5 in the back of the room, and I said, I get to read the whole thing? He said, sure. So if you need to go get some coffee or take a nap. Chapter 5, how it works. Rarely have we seen a person fail who has thoroughly followed our path. Those who do not recover are people who cannot or will not completely give themselves to this simple program. Usually men and women who are constitutionally incapable of being honest with themselves. There are such unfortunates. They are not at fault. They seem to have been born that way. They are naturally incapable of grasping and developing a manner of living which demands rigorous honesty. Their chances are less than average. There are those, too, who suffer from grave emotional and mental disorders, but many of them do recover if they have the capacity to be honest. Our stories disclose in a general way what we used to be like, what happened, and what we are like now. If you have decided you want what we have and are willing to go to any lengths to get it, then you are ready to take certain steps. At some of these, we balked. We thought we could find an easier, softer way, but we could not. With all the earnestness at our command, we beg of you to be fearless and thorough from the very start. Some of us have tried to hold on to our old ideas, and the result was nil until we let go absolutely. Remember that we deal with alcohol, cunning, baffling, powerful. Without help, it is too much for us. But there is one who has all power. That one is God. May you find him now. Half measures avail us nothing. We stood at the turning point. We ask his protection and care with complete abandon. Here are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery. 1, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol, that our lives had become unmanageable. 2, came to believe that a power greater than ourselves could restore us to sanity. 3, made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understood him. 4, made a searching and fearless moral inventory of ourselves. 5, admitted to God, to ourselves, and to another human being the exact nature of our wrongs. 6, were entirely ready to have God remove all these defects of character. 7, humbly ask him to remove our shortcomings. 7, made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. 9, made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. 10, continued to take personal inventory, and when we were wrong, promptly admitted it. 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God as we understood him, praying only for knowledge of his will for us and the power to carry that out. 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps, we tried to carry this message to alcoholics and to practice these principles in all our affairs. Many of us exclaim, "What an order. I can't go through with it." Do not be discouraged. No one among us has been able to maintain anything like perfect adherence to these principles. We are not saints. The point is that we are willing to grow along spiritual lines. The principles we have set down are guides to progress. We claim spiritual progress rather than spiritual perfection. Our description of the alcoholic, the chapter to the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. C, that God could and would if he were sought.
The 12 traditions are to the group conscience as the 12 steps are to the individual. Alex G. will read the 12 traditions.
Hi, I'm Alex. I'm an alcoholic. And these are the 12 traditions, short form. 1, our common welfare should come first. Personal recovery depends upon AA unity. 2, for our group purpose, there's but one ultimate authority, a loving God as he may express himself in our group conscience. Our leaders are but trusted servants. They do not govern. 3, the only requirement for AA membership is a desire to stop drinking. 4, each group should be autonomous except in matters affecting other groups or AA as a whole. 5, each group has but one primary purpose, to carry its message to the alcoholic who still suffers. 6, an AA group ought never endorse, finance, or lend the AA name to any related facility or outside enterprise, lest problems of money, property, and prestige divert us from our primary purpose. 7, every AA group ought to be fully self-supporting, declining outside contributions. 8, Alcoholics Anonymous should remain forever non-professional, but our service centers may employ special workers. 9, AA as such ought never be organized, but we may create service boards or committees directly responsible to those they serve. 10, Alcoholics Anonymous has no opinion on outside issues, hence the AA name ought never be drawn into public controversy. 11, our public relations policy is based on attraction rather than promotion. We need always maintain personal anonymity at the level of press, radio, and films. And 12, anonymity is a spiritual foundation of all our traditions, ever reminding us to place principles before personalities.
focus of this workshop is on the steps, service, and spirituality. Tom, I, and Sandy B will collectively be focusing on the steps, service, and spirituality as they go through the day. Just a brief update on our schedule, because I want to be sure we're all aware. Tom and Sandy, and I'll let them introduce themselves more formally here in a moment, will be speaking for about 2 hours this morning, so we'll go approximately till about 12 or 12:30. We will then take an hour break. If you'd like lunch, whatever the case might be, feel free to do so. As soon as we're ready to break, we'll set then a return time. We will have an afternoon wrap-up session, take a short break, and then we'll follow that and wrap up the day with a question and answer session with Tom and Sandy. So please feel free to join us throughout the day. When the panelists are finished, we will then take that short break. Sorry, I kind of jumped ahead of my format here. Now I would like to introduce Sandy B, who will begin our session today on the steps, service, and spirituality.
Morning, everybody. My name's Sandy Beach, and I'm an alcoholic. How you all doing? Thank you very much for inviting me up here. I can't tell you how happy I am to be sharing this opportunity with my friend Tom. He's one man that I greatly respect in the fellowship, and I look up to him, and it's just always an honor to do anything together with Tom. We had breakfast this morning, and I told him yesterday that an idea occurred to me as a way of setting it up, and he agreed to let me do this. I think he liked it, I don't know. He's just so polite that... But anyway, I recall when I was in the Marine Corps, the last assignment that I had was with a team of very, very senior officers. I was a junior officer, headed by a major general, and there was 6 or 7 colonels and lieutenant colonels. And basically what this group did was to go to other service schools, foreign countries, and put on an 8-hour presentation about the entire Marine Corps in a hypothetical situation 5 years in the future. So it was a great, huge presentation, and it covered, you know, a war breaking out somewhere and how they would respond and how the planning is done, and then each one of the colonels would come up as a specialist in airplanes and ship-to-shore movement, supply, artillery, and it just went on with all of this armada of components that make up the Marine Corps. And then the general would get up and he would close the presentation after 8 hours by saying, what you saw today, all of this huge thing, serves one purpose. And then a slide would come on, and it would be the individual Marine infantryman with his rifle. And he would say, all of that is to make his job easier. In other words, all of that was aimed at where the real work is done, down with that one man engaging, in that case, the enemy. And we got thinking that Alcoholics Anonymous is organized like that, that we have this enormous structure of intergroups and volunteers and traditions and activities and conferences like this one. But the primary purpose of all of this is to support and increase as much as we can the basic AA unit, which is one alcoholic talking to another. So when you look at it, there's 2 things that are essential, and one is to have this entire structure so that AA can reach out as effectively as possible to as many suffering alcoholics as there are. That's the one side, and that has to function as efficiently and as well as possible, and that's what Tom is going to talk about. And the other part is when that one alcoholic reaches out to the next one with the AA message, what is being communicated? Is that being communicated in its purest form? Is that? And so we're going to share the burden here, and in the morning, we're going to discuss like a history review of how did AA get organized. I mean, you know, when you go back, how do we end up with these various things that we have, including the service structures and the traditions and conferences and all of those activities. And then in the afternoon, Tom will go into where are we today? Have we evolved in some directions that might need some correcting, or what are some ideas, et cetera, et cetera. And then I'm going to do how did the AA message get started? Where did it come from? What is the history on that? Then in the afternoon, well, what is that message? What is this 12 step? What is the essence of the spiritual message? And do we need to redouble our efforts to make sure that it isn't getting confused out there today? So that sort of sets the stage. And so now Tom's our main man here, so he's going to start in on the whole thing with the structure and everything.
Okay. Thank you very much, Sandy. Tom Ivester, an alcoholic. I'm a member of the primary purpose group of AA in Southern Pines, North Carolina. And if my voice sounds different, it's because it is. I've got a little bronchial infection, and so if I stop in mid-stride, Sandy, it'll mean it's kicked in. And so we're well rehearsed enough that we'll just fall right in. You won't even know. You think I'm still up here. And I count it a pleasure to work with this guy. I don't know of anybody that's more steeped in knowledge and insight and ability to communicate what this program's about than my buddy. And so I'm just pleased to be here, pleased to be dealing with what we're dealing with. And I'll come close to what he said. I'll probably deviate a little bit. That's just the way drunks are, you know. I'm extremely well prepared. This is for show. That looks like a whole bunch of stuff. There is a lot of stuff in there, none of which has anything to do with what we're doing this morning. At least not much, anyway. And my material is compliments of the Palmer House. So, how I want to approach what Sandy was talking about, I guess they kind of look for one of the older dudes to talk about history. I'm working on my 49th year in the fellowship, and that they always figure they want to get you on before you check out because they know you're not going to be here too long. And that's why they put us on Friday. They didn't think we'd last. And yeah, I don't think there's any special knowledge that comes out of that kind of vintage, but it does cause some proximity, and that I'm one of the fortunate people still remaining on the planet who had the chance to meet and interact a little with Bill, our founder, and value that enormously, and knew a good many of the first 100 members, yeah. And so it's a part of the legacy, and it sort of gives me a feel about history, if not an overwhelming knowledge. Now, how I want to, in all honesty, I'm not overly interested in the facts, the details of history. I'm interested in what happened, what happened. And whether it happened on Tuesday the 9th or 2 years later, I couldn't care less. I'm just grateful that it happened. So I'm not a technician on history. If you want to challenge me on any date, I probably won't mention any. I'll yield to whatever you think because I won't try to defend it. So what's important to me is where we came from, and I want to look at history from the standpoint of the developmental consideration of history. What was it in our history that shaped us to do things the way we do them. And so I just want to pick out a few highlights in walking through a bit of that. Most of it you'll be very familiar with. Although we didn't start with Ebby and Roland, it's the place where the visible identification of our roots came from those two guys and the experience that happened. And you remember that story that Ebby was the town clown up in Vermont, and they had him arrested for shooting birds or something in his house or whatever, doing something goofy, as usual. And they had him in court getting ready to lock him up, and Roland was a guy who had been struck sober by God after talking to a psychiatrist in Switzerland. Remember that? You know, he went to this eminent guy in Switzerland, got struck bone dry. Unfortunately, it didn't stay that way. But he stayed that way long enough to do something with Ebby that I think formed some of the ethics of Alcoholics Anonymous. And so when he heard that his buddy Ebby was in trouble down at the courthouse, he went to the court and he petitioned the judge to let me have this guy. Let me try to do something with him. And so the judge was glad to turn him over to anybody that would just take him out of town. And so he gave him to Roland. And it's interesting to me that the trail that led to the formation of Alcoholics Anonymous, you now see that in a whole different kind of stage, because we still do a lot of interaction with courts. But I'll come back to it and contrast what happened between Ebby and the judge and Roland and what we do now. And what you'll observe is a 180-degree difference in it. And so, but that sort of laid the groundwork. And Ebby got sober, and then, what that set up, I think the principle that came out of that was about active outreach and a thing we today call CPC, a cooperation with the professional community. And that's exactly what that was for the well-being of Ebby. And so he wound up down in New York, sober, jumped into the Oxford group, got very active in that. And his friend from back home in Vermont, Bill Wilson, was living in New York. Ebby made a call on him. He just called him up and said he wanted to come visit. And if you know the history, Bill was thrilled because he knew Ebby would bring a jug. And to his dismay, Ebby came in sober and acting weird. And Bill asked him what was wrong, and he said, "I got religion." Well, his thoughts of a drunken orgy were gone, and so he's sitting there with this fellow with the gleaming eyes. And well, if you ever saw Ebby, I had the chance to meet him. Gleaming eyes is not the way to describe Ebby. He looked like death warmed over, I swear to God. That's an ugly boy. But anyway, he's working on Bill, and he told Bill he got religion, and Bill got a little intrigued by it. Then he wound up stumbling in and out of the Oxford groups for a while, getting on, trying to savor that kind of religious nectar. But something happened when he met with Ebby, because he met a guy who was like him, who didn't seem to be like him anymore. And that made an indelible impression on him, that there really was a way out of this thing. So he fumbled with it. And he didn't have much success. He was just drunk on an installment plan. And so he finally wound up on what turned out to be, I'll skip over a bunch of them, what turned out to be his last trip to Towns Hospital. And I want to underline the name William Silkworth. William Silkworth. Because for my money, William Silkworth could be named one of the third founders of this program, that his role was so important. And what happened to Bill, and I think everybody in AA is familiar with his experience, where he's gone through this thing, and he finally got to that point of utter desperation and cried out, "God, if there is a God, show yourself to me." And he had that well-known hot flash, that great white light, where he had that transforming experience, and he was to never be the same man again. And he went through that change, and for some reason, Sandy mentioned this earlier with he and I. He came out of that not only with restoration with his own problem, but with a zeal to help other alcoholics. And the reason I say that we ought to underline silkworm was that what happened to Bill, I don't know, I've had things like that, seem like that, happen to me from drinking too much wine. And I just get really wild, crazy, and there's no time. Most of the time, put a net on me and lock me up somewhere. But with Bill, we were blessed with having a guy who had the insight and wisdom to say, hey, Bill, I don't know what happened, man, but you better keep it because it sure beats what you had. That was wonderful counsel into a region that we hadn't gone. And he was able to steady Bill and say, hang with it, hang with it. What a great example of CPC, eh? What a great example for a guy to have enough insight to steady the guy and say, hang on, buddy, hang on. And then later, it was brave enough when it was totally unheard of to let a patient that's just barely sober come back into the hospital and carry the message. Well, we didn't have a message in, but to carry his experience to other patients. Wonderful thing. Now, when you look at the history, you see the powerful role that our friends outside had. Thank God for them. Because if it hadn't been, I doubt if we'd probably gone to the moon. But we had people, blessed with people, who held us steady while we kind of got things going. And so that beginning, and Bill had a real good experience with chasing drunks. Now, I'll just mention one thing about the lady that was to be formidable in Al-Anon. It's amazing how people are helpful to us more than they may realize. But if you remember when Bill was going through all this stuff and he had nothing but disappointment, failure, nobody staying sober, had somebody trying to commit suicide in the house, all this kind of stuff, just the typical mayhem of dealing with drunks. And he said to his wife one day, with total discouragement, this thing isn't working. Nobody is catching on. Nobody's getting straight. And Lois, Bill's wife, said something profoundly important. She said, yeah, Bill, you are. You are. And that set a principle that there's no such thing as an unsuccessful 12-step call. There's no such thing as an unsuccessful attempt to reach out to somebody else, because it's the reaching out to people that gives us what we need, that strengthens us. And so results are not what make that, it's effort. So that notion that we try to carry the message, and if we do it sincerely, we can't miss. And so Bill got through that period, and then he started to get his little bit of business back together. He was a sort of unsuccessful stockbroker with a lot of imagination. And he got a business opportunity, and he made that trip to not too far from here, to Akron, Ohio. And I think even in its heyday, Akron was a kind of a sad place, even when it was bustling. Man, it's really sad now. It's filled with empty buildings from where tire factories used to be. Bill went there, and he went on this venture, and he had this scheme of some way he was going to sell a bunch of stuff. And as sometimes happened, nothing worked out. Nothing worked out. And so here he is in a strange town, and he's run his course. You ever been there? Where you've just run your course and you can't think of any other angle to shoot. And that's where Bill was. And God knows I've been there many times. And I tell you this, I had an opportunity. I didn't have an opportunity. I made an opportunity. I was in Akron a while back, a few years back. And every time I go up there, I get somebody to take me on a historic tour. And it's just a marvelous experience to go back and revisit those places and just touch base with where we came from. And I always treasure that. I had never gone into the Mayflower, the hotel. And I'd always wanted to, but it had been converted from a hotel into some kind of a sheltered environment for a special population. I'm not sure who. And you got to respect their privacy. And So I never had gone in, but I was walking around one day with an enterprising drunk. He said, "Would you like to go in the Mayflower?" I said, "Yeah, but you can't do that." He said, "Watch this." And my kind of drunk. So he just waited until somebody came out, grabbed the door, said, "Come on." So we're in. Then we walk in the hotel, and we're on what they call the lobby, but it's really the mezzanine. It was that second landing. And so I went up there with the guy, and you know how sometimes there's things that you just want to be private, that you don't want to talk about it, you just want to experience it and savor the experience. And without planning, you know, I found myself standing there, and it's something about a bar. I don't care, you can make the Sistine Chapel out of it, it still looks like a bar. I mean, you don't have nobody has to tell you. You walk in there and say, "Man, this was a bar." And you just know it. It's that intuitive knowledge of the alcoholic. So I went in, and I knew that was the bar. And I was casing it, you know, looking over, and I see over there where the phone was and is. And I'm sitting there, and that, you know, virtual reality is what you call it now. But I was sitting there kind of playing through my own mind. Now, I didn't have to use any imagination because I've been to that point where I was down to my last shekel and totally out of plans and no earthly idea of what to do. And have been torn between either fighting again or giving up. And I always gave up. And so I'm sitting there, I just feel that. I started I walked through how I saw Bill's experience occurring. And I physically took the walk. I walked back and forth across that lobby. Didn't say anything to my buddy. But I'm just walking back and forth from the one side of that lobby to the other. And reliving how it feels to be standing on the brink of that and not wanting to do it, but I always did. Yeah. And he walked on over to the phone and made that historic phone call. I tell you what really impacted me that day was not only reliving the experience. It's like listening to a drunk tell his story. But I was listening to Bill's story, and oh my. And I'll tell you what struck me profoundly that day, and does to this day, was that I felt the full realization of what a tremendously critical juncture that was in our history. Because the destiny of every one of us hung directly on the actions that Bill Wilson took that day. We were hanging by an extremely slender thread. And thank God he made the right moves. If he'd have made the wrong move, we may still have a destiny to come, but it would have been different. It would have been different. But this guy, with the help of his God, went over, picked up the phone, called, made that historic phone call to this Reverend Tonk fella in Akron, and asked him that. It had to be a weird-sounding question. I need a drunk. You know, I need an alcoholic. Very few people order an alcoholic. I can just imagine that guy saying, "What'd you say?" But he would, again, we were fortunate that this guy seemed to have an inkling. You know, he'd been involved with Oxford groups, and he had an inkling that what this call was about. And so he gave him a list of folk, and as everybody called, Bill called, was busy. You know how it is, a busy world. And then he got a gal by the name of Henrietta that on the phone that understood what he was talking about, that understood. And she was a non-alcoholic, but she understood. And she said, "I think I know somebody." And she set up the meeting with Dr. Bob. And that was a truly historic point in our history. Again, this powerful relationship with our friends that help us through the fog, you know, so we can get steady and get strong in what we're doing. And then that meeting with those two men, where they went in supposedly for 15 minutes and went about 6 hours. true alcoholics. His workshop will probably end about Saturday, 3 o'clock. But no, we'll be on time. But those two men met, and exactly what Sandy was talking about in that great opening. Something forged that day that is absolutely the most universally important thing in all of Alcoholics Anonymous. These two folks sat down, a kind of a discredited stockbroker and an old doc on his last legs, and they sat down, and Bill told him his story, told him about his condition. And here's a stockbroker explaining an illness to a physician. We didn't even call it an illness then, but he's explaining a condition. And the doc's reaction was, finally, somebody understands. And what happened that day, unlike with Ebby, that was a different level of thing. Here were two human beings connected at the fractured level, where they were broken. And these two guys, they had an identification. And my belief is that what formed that day was the basic tenet of Alcoholics Anonymous, the basic tenet, that just like Sandy was saying, everything we drew emanated from that. Everything that we do grew out of that unique understanding that seemed to occur between those two guys. Powerful thing. I think, we do a lot of stuff. We just finished an international convention with many, many thousands of people there. But I think the most noble thing that we do, the greatest we ever are, is when one alcoholic sincerely opens up and shares with another. That's the most powerful thing. And so everything else sort of emanates out of that. And that form, that principle was formed that day in Alcoholics Anonymous. I tell you, I'll just throw this, and we may come back to it later, but I really believe that there's enormous influence that does and should come out of what happened with Bill and Bob. When you start thinking about, and I won't elaborate on here, but just maybe tease you a little bit with it. When you start thinking about things that are troubling to you in Alcoholics Anonymous, things that you worry about and wish were done differently, the basic measure of where it is in regard to that basic tenet. It either is congruent with that or it's moving away. And if it's moving away, it's moving into thin ice. And so I think it's fundamentally important, that piece of our history, defining who we are and putting a limit on how grandiose we get in our notions of who we are. That's so tremendously important thing that happened that day. Then I've got North Carolina time. I don't have a clue what time it is. Is it 11?
It's an hour earlier.
Huh?
It's an hour earlier than normal.
I appreciate that, Julia. One reason I'm in this shape today, I turned myself over to Julia and Phil yesterday and said, have your way with me. And they did. Man, we were in prison. Well, anyway. I was ready for bed last night. I'll put it that way. I won't rush this too much now, but we got about 100 years of stuff, not quite, but we got a bunch of stuff to go. But I think you can sort of see where we're trying to get with this thing, is what is it that forms us as we are? And then when we take a look at where we are today, are we where we say we want to be, is the whole thrust of this thing. And so, with what happened with those guys, they hung together, and then they found a third guy. And so the whole concept of each one reach one was born, and they started to move on, and they captured that drunk lawyer and brought him to submission, and then on and on. And there was a little gal in Akron and Cleveland who was, for me, somebody wrote a book about her a while back called it Sister Ignatia, Angel of Alcoholics Anonymous. If you haven't seen that book, it is a wonderful read. And I think it gave me an appreciation of the tremendous value of her role in the forming just the basic operational procedures that we do in AA. And her work with Dr. Bob and starting to get people into to pay. Bob gets all the credit, but Sister Ignatia did all the work. She almost got defrocked by the Catholic Church because she was, well, that was a whole story by itself. Read the book. It's a great read. And but what a tremendous gal she is, or was, a great gal. And what a super contribution that gal lives on. I spoke at the Sister Ignatia banquet about a year or so ago down in Cleveland. She lives on in this program. And so tremendous, tremendous role. And what it set up, again, was that professional community meshing well with our efforts in AAs for a good outcome. I'll tell you one thing, it's funny how a legacy lives on. I have the opportunity to travel extensively all around the country. Akron, Ohio is the only place I know where the original hospital ethic is in place. They still do it like it was 1935. They got different language and stuff, but my God, they still do it just like they did in the old days. And that's the only place in the country that I know. So, that huge contribution. A fellow by the name of Clarence Snyder emerged in that early influx of AAs. And Clarence Snyder was a guy, he had a little different drum beat, but he did some signal work in Alcoholics Anonymous that had profound impact. Yeah, I think he was a guy that perfected the art of the 12-step call. And for my money, he influenced the development of sponsorship as well as anybody I know. He was a real driving, hard driving, crusading type of fella and did great work. He, by the way, is buried about 10 miles from my house. And never knew that. But anyway, I knew it now. I went to the funeral, so I knew where they buried him. I was there. He was a great contributor in those early days of formulating this thing. He never did give up on the notion that the General Service Office ought to be in his garage. But other than that, he was right on. We started to get a little bit of growth. Now, it doesn't take much growth for alcoholics to get grandiose. Can you imagine? There are more people. When we formed the notion of a worldwide movement, there are 3 times as many people in this room as there were in all of Alcoholics Anonymous. And these guys are taking on a worldwide movement. Can you imagine? Can you imagine if somebody said, "I'll make a motion that we invade China," or something? I mean, that sounds goofy now, but that's about what they were doing. These guys just had that crazy vision of doing something, and they were an interesting crowd. With all of that overwhelming success, they must have had 40, 50 members. They said, "We need to write a book to tell the world about this thing so everybody will know to jump on the bandwagon." And so they wrote the book, like to kill each other doing it, but they wrote the book. Bill held the pen and they held his feet, and so they wrestled it together and produced the book out of that crowd. It's always struck me as just so typically alcoholic that you take off on this barnstorming deal, and they're barely out of the starting blocks, and here they go. Thank God for it. If it had been me, we'd probably had it in my backyard. But great deal. A thing that happened, and it's in line with that sort of grandiosity that was emerging in, was, folks always think you got to throw money at it to make it work right, that you got to have some money. I'm not one of them. I believe when it comes to this kind of work, when you put money in it, you suck the heart right out of it, is what happened. And that would have been true then, but if you probably remember that Rockefeller dinner, where they took advantage of some contacts, threw together a dinner. What they were going to do was bring in a lot of folks with deep pockets and say, "We need some money," and leave there billionaires. That was the plan. And they put all this bunch together, put a drunk at each table. One of them at one table said the guy just got out of the nut house 2 or 3 days earlier, but they had him there to give credibility when they started talking about give us the money. And so they made the hit. Now, in the minds of us, you know, those us of us who were there then, in our minds, these were noble things, that if we could get some money, we could do some stuff, and we could get the work done and all of this kind of stuff. And thank God for prudent friends with insight, because the Rockefeller bunch said very eloquently, don't you think money will louse this thing up? Profoundly important, because had it not been for that, we would have gone into the money business and it would have sucked the heart out of it, and I'll guarantee you we'd have had a different history. But thank God for those friends who said, don't screw it up, you got something good going. Made for some lean years, but it was tremendously important stuff. It was slow growth when you look at that. We say 100, but that depended on what day you counted. Best I can tell, we never did get 100 steady soldiers, you know, that in that first formative time. And so, but we were moving, had some vision, and something happened in the early. Well, a lot of stuff happened, but one I want to single out was that Jack Alexander thing. And what it did was, I think, demonstrated the value of public information, of letting people know that Alcoholics Anonymous here, that there's a solution. Now, Jack Alexander wasn't the only one that did it, but for some reason, his article had more impact than all the others put together. But we started to get some recognition, probably beyond what we deserved, but we got a lot of it. We started getting written up in some magazines. And Jack Alexander wrote one. I guess one reason his had appeal was that he didn't write it till he attended enough meetings. The way he described it, that he'd never breathed so much smoke or drank so much heavily sugared coffee in his life. But when he was properly saturated with that stuff and with what he felt today, he was ready to write. And he wrote an article that had enormous impact. Now you picture this fledgling group of alcoholics bunched up in New York and Akron and Cleveland. And all at once, an article goes out saying, hey guys, there's help. And in no time at all, 8,000 screaming pleas for help. Can you imagine that? Can you imagine 1/3 of this group answering 8,000 calls from every corner of the country? That was the dilemma. That was the quandary. And just a whole bunch of stuff grew out of that. One, certainly the value of public information. God knows how much importance and impact that had. Tremendously important. The other thing was that we learned a lot of ways to carry the message. There's more than one way to do it. And when folks said, what are we going to do with all these things? The guy said, some of us travel. And when we travel, we'll carry the message. And between then, we'll write. You know, and what happened, I tell you, it's the most moving part of the history to me, is I can picture. In fact, I held a flag in a place. But what happened was all around this country, somebody or some group of somebodies, usually somebody, would get the message and they would say, we'll do it here, wherever that was, Yuma, Arizona, wherever. And somebody stuck the flag and said, we'll do it here. And we'll hold on till help comes. And that's exactly what happened. Yeah, I was in a town one time when there was some around there, but most of it was horizontal most of the time. So I'm the only guy standing. And I tell you, when you're standing there holding that flag by yourself, it's a lonely vigil. And you appreciate it when the cavalry comes. I guarantee you that. So I really admire and respect those people. Somebody did it in Chicago. Somebody told me who it was. But somebody, yeah, there you go. Yeah, that's the guy. Yeah, he held the flag. And then somebody came. And then before long, you got 800,000 groups. You got a lot of groups in Chicago. Know that. But somebody started that. Thank God for those folk. The huge influx in the world. My wonderful notes have just absolutely. It's 50 of something. Oh, that's the date, for God's sakes. That 50 was the date of our first international. and and we bunched up in Cleveland. It bunched up in Cleveland. It brought in, back then it was essentially a business thing. We brought in delegates from around the country, and in 50 the traditions were introduced to the fellowship. And that was an important place where we started to build the future, where Bill had the foresight with the other guys to say, here's how this thing can work. And those were introduced. Knowing how we are, it gave 5 years to think about it before we made a decision. And then 5 years later, down in St. Louis at the Second International, the traditions were adopted. And very importantly, the fellowship was turned over to its members. There was no longer any sugar daddy taking care of business. And Bill became a member. Now, he was kind of an important member, and he was called on a lot. But the dynamics were put in place for us to become a fellowship that's grassroots driven. And something I hope we'll visit a little bit more, but the deal is it's in our hands. And there's no longer any kind of a central leadership point. And the leadership will come from us all around the country. Very important place in our history where we had to take that thing and become responsible all across the board. The thing I think I want to wrap up around this is in talking about. I want to put just a general characterization. You know, that part was sort of talking about how the fellowship developed, you know, how we grew as a fellowship. During that time, one of the significant things about that segment of our history, up until, well, I came in 57, and certainly when I came in, it was still very much the case. Up say 60s or somewhere like that. I promise you about dates, I don't have a clue. But we were basically characterized by extensive, intensive action. We were not a real thoughtful society that got off into retreats and studies and all this kind of stuff. There wasn't time. We were busy doing the work. And so you can imagine what folks who suddenly flooded with 8,000 requests for help, you imagine what their primary purpose was, can't you? Yeah, one was to just sort of try to keep up, for God's sakes. You know, even when I came along, you know, today I get a 12-step call once in a while. I've had 3 at the same time, different people. You know, and I guarantee you that's fun when you get 3 brand new alcoholics in a car, and I put the one with 30 minutes sober looking after the one with 15 minutes. And I guarantee you it is fun. And so what characterized that was intensive activity. We did a lot of work one-on-one with 12-step calls. And the thing that the powerful principle that came out of that really governed how we functioned as a society for a long time, was that every one of us, you could pretty safely say, every one of us came in as a direct result of another alcoholic reaching out a hand and saying, hang on and come on in with us. Very personal. Everybody had that kind of linkage to the heart of the fellowship. And so that really formed. What happens when somebody reaches in and pulls you out of whatever you're in? What's formed there is a loyalty second to none. Second to none. And that's why with no hesitation, you know, somebody call you from the most ratty part of town, and you go without question and say, let's get it on. You know, and so that was a very important principle, a very important ethic that developed in Alcoholics Anonymous at that time. It drove the service apparatus, It drove the service apparatus because that feeling of intense personal level connection was there. I'm emphasizing that a little bit because you'll find that to be quite changed today, I think. And it is one of the things that we ought to consider when we're thinking about what shapes us and what drives us and what we ought to be concerned about today. Well, Sandy, I think I've said enough about that.
Okay.
We're putting it in your hands, buddy.
Okay.
All right, okay. Thank you.
Boy, I could have sat there for another hour, Tom. That was just great. Okay. Now I'm shifting the focus to the message rather than the organization. And so I just going back in my mind, for some unknown reason, I thought about the Washingtonian Society, which existed in the 1840s and got up to 300,000 or 400,000 people sober, and then disappeared off the planet inside of a decade. And when you look at that, there's obviously the normal reason for its attrition was that it got involved in outside issues. That got political, it got involved in outside issues, which sometimes implies that had it not gotten involved in outside issues, it would still be going. But I seriously doubt that because, number one, it had no spiritual dimension. There was no higher power. We were staying sober, or people staying sober then on their own power. And number two, it had no message. There was no message. The message was, hey, I just signed a pledge yesterday, and look at me. And I'm going to go get that guy to sign a pledge. And then he came in and said, I just signed a pledge, look at me. And then they tried to get very important people to sign pledges, like the mayor, so that then you'd go, well, I think I'll join that organization and schmooze with the mayor. You follow what I mean? It was sort of like a pyramid club with a lot of inertia and a lot of parades. They were very big on parades. Boom, 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 through town. Look at me, look at me, look at me. Isn't it wonderful that I'm sober? And that has a lot of momentum, but you can see that eventually, boom. You know what I mean? It's going to go, hey, you know, this is getting old, playing the drum in a parade. Boom, boom, look at me. Look at those guys in the bar. They seem to be having a lot of fun over there. So there was no message other than come on and join us. Come on and join us. So my point is that you can have something that attracted a lot of people in. And if there is no message, then this whole structure was wasted. You follow what I'm saying? 400,000 people is a lot of people to generate in that short a period of time. So it's possible to promote, to do all this, but if there isn't, and you know what's missing? God. Let's get down to the bottom line. That is what is missing, because the power that addresses powerlessness is a God of our understanding, not by anybody else's definition, but by our own. So I throw that one out just as a history lesson in what wouldn't work in the long term. Now, I suppose our message, the one that we have today, clearly started with the Oxford group when Frank Buckman, a Lutheran minister, decided that the hierarchy of church organization had sort of messed up the basic spiritual message that was handed down by a great teacher a couple thousand years ago. And that if we could just eliminate all the middlemen and just have a do-it-yourself kind of a deal, where you take these principles and you just meet in your own house. You know, maybe 10 of us, we could just meet there and talk about our lives and how difficult it is to maintain your serenity and peace in this society that we're living in, and then we could all share and we could pray together, And we could probably get a lot more done than going through all the formal things of attending church itself. So that caught on. That idea of do it yourself, we'll meet together. And it spread. Now, it was promoted. It was really hyped up. They, again, liked celebrities, and they liked a lot of hoopla, newspaper, etc. As a matter of fact, that's how it got to Akron. It was a man named Jim Newton was working for Thomas Edison in Florida. When Harvey Firestone came out, you know, the Edisons and the Fire, all the celebrity, they hang out together. And Firestone said, you know, I'm looking for a special assistant, somebody who could just kind of manage a lot of things for me in Akron. And Edison said, I got just the guy. I have a guy, Jim Newton, who is a real estate guy, but he's been doing a lot of good work for me. You ought to take him out there. Well, Newton had joined the Oxford group and was very interested in. He himself was not an alcoholic, but he saw alcoholics getting sober in this Oxford movement. And so when he went to Akron, lo and behold, one of Firestone's sons is a raging alcoholic. And Jim said to him, he said, why don't I take him with me? I'm going to an Oxford convention somewhere, and he could see it, and maybe it would help him. And it did help him, and so Harvey Firestone said, it's time for the Oxford movement to come to Akron. And that's when they went to Walter Tunks, the minister that Tom was talking about. And when the Oxford movement came to Akron, it was like the President of the United States is coming. I mean, all the hotels were booked. Harvey Firestone is supporting this, and Reverend Tunks and was in his church, and the newspapers, and hoop-de-de-doop-de-de-doop. And a couple of people saw that. Henrietta Seiberling was one of them, and Ann Smith was another one. Hey, let's go to this. And Bob, you're coming too. You know what I mean? And so that's how that got started in Akron, so that they were having these meetings in the Williams home. And so they were passing on a message that was not clearly codified. They had 6 principles. And I'm sure, I've never studied the history of the Oxford movement, but I have a hunch that if you went and looked from city to city around the country, it was the same and it was different. Anybody ever have that feeling in AA? I mean, if you get sober in Chicago for 10 years and then you move to Tampa, your first thing you're going to say is, they're doing it wrong down here. Because they're clearly doing it different, you know. I know when I moved to Tampa, I went, what? Who in the world came up with a meeting starting time of 8:15? I mean, 8:30, but 8:15, why would you pick quarter after the hour for a starting time of a meeting? And probably would have to go back to see who started it down there. And maybe his job didn't get out until this time, and 8:15 was the earliest he could get it going, and we're still doing it. And so there were the differences. And when they look back on coming into an Oxford group meeting, and this was alcoholics as well as non-alcoholics, because it was mostly non-alcoholics, the husbands and wives came together. They were all met in a living room, and here's a new couple. We'd like for them to hear what the rest of us think. And so we'd go around the room and we'd go, well, I came here about a year ago, and you know, my life was going pretty good, but now, as a result of the efforts that we make to get closer to our God, I just feel entirely different. It's really wonderful. Do you think you all would like to join us in this search to get closer to our higher power? Yes, we would. Well, good. These three guys are going to take Harry upstairs. And whoop, up they go. And then they got right to the point. We didn't mess around long. They just looked right at him and they went, Harry, we're glad to have you. Do you believe in God? Harry, do you believe in God? Do you believe in God? Do you believe in God? And, you know, it's like, what are you going to say? You know? Yes, good, get on your knees. And they pray and pray and pray. Oh, yes. And there'd be a wonderful feeling, a sense that this was all about God, and we'd go back down. And there's many ways you could do that. You can pat somebody on the head, or, you know. Now, did we do that today? We hug each other. We put our hands on each other's backs. There is some of that sense of one to another welcoming in the spiritual sense. And we are concerned with your well-being, and your well-being is intimately tied with your relationship to a higher power. This is the goal, and it was the goal of the Oxford movement. It still is the goal of AA. Because we know as much as I can personally help someone I'm sponsoring in the initial weeks, just to keep his morale up, and in a way he is staying sober because of the spiritual energy that's coming out of me and my home group. Eventually, for the long haul, for the rest of his life, he has to have a connection with his own higher power or her own higher power. And that's what's going to sustain everyone for the rest of our lives. And so the message clearly got started and the format for groups, for home groups. Home group, what is your home group? You met in a home. You know, now we meet in church basements and everything, but it was very common to meet in a home. And the very personal attention and the spiritual principles of surrendering, of confession, sharing with someone else, of inventory, and of reaching out to someone else. All of that, the surrender and the reaching out, were all contained in those early Oxford tenets, if you will. But there were other things that Bill looked at. One of them was William James, who he got a hold of the book, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And I remember when I was about a year sober, my sponsor had a copy of that, and he gave it to me, and I tried to read it. I want to tell you, I tried so hard to read that, and every sentence was so far over my head. I mean, this guy was not only brilliant, he was a genius. And it wasn't a book that he wrote. It turned out it was a series of 17 or 18 lectures that he gave at Edinburgh University in Scotland to the elite. And he was there to discuss, you know, God, people were educated beyond my wildest dreams. I mean, you know, if you didn't speak 3 or 4 languages, what are you doing here? And so he would reference things in history and just go on and on. And so it took quite a few years later for my brain to clear up, for me to plow through that. And it was really fun. I mean, you had to really realize you're going to struggle to read through this book. But what came out of that, you see, when I first heard about it, I thought he just studied people with spiritual experiences and recorded them and found out that that almost without exception, they occurred to people who were at a deep bottom, that they were in some sort of terrible pain due to the situations that life had placed them in, and they were able thusly to surrender to a deeper level than they ever had before, and had these profoundly transforming personal experiences. And that's true that that was in there, but that was not the point of his series of lectures. It turns out that his series of lectures was that he had studied religion, all religions, and was trying to evaluate whether they had contributed or hurt society in the long run. And his conclusion was that it was about even. When looking at what have they really contributed and what have they, because we look and there's wars and there's all kinds of negative things and then there's the positive things. And this is what he concluded was their biggest contribution. The biggest contribution was that because of religions, individuals had these transforming experiences. And those individuals contributed mightily to society. And we can look back at Bill Wilson and Dr. Bob as two. Look at what those two transforming experiences have contributed to the world. And what every recovered alcoholic is contributing to not only his or her family, but his or her society. An immense change. And so that was the value that came out of his studies, were these. So what I'm laying the groundwork for is spiritual awakening. That is the point of all of this. That when that occurs and that is released on society, wonderful things happen. Wonderful things. That ball of energy, you can track it and look. A lot of you know Peggy M. from Omaha, Nebraska, and I know Tom does. And I was at a convention out there, and Peggy was speaking on a Saturday. There must have been 2,000 people there. And she said, before I speak, I'd like to ask a favor, if it's all right. Well, who's going to say no to Peggy in Omaha? And she said, would all the women that I sponsor stand up? And I don't know. I'd say that 50 people stood up. Would all the people that they sponsor stand up? Would all the women that they sponsor stand up? Would all the women that they sponsor stand up? And when she got through, I think half the room was standing. And you go, I wonder if one person can make a difference. One ball of spiritual energy released into the women of Omaha. There it is. So we see that William James' observation was very acute, that the contribution that are made by religions was the transforming experience in individuals. Someone who is around a church like I was growing up, who didn't have this happen, didn't appear to be of much great value anywhere. You talk a good game, but you're not really doing much. You follow what I'm saying? I'm unable to maintain the principles that I've learned. I keep failing. I keep falling down. And I'm criticizing myself. Why can't I live up to the values that I espouse? I don't have the power to live up to them. And a lot of people don't. So I just throw that in, William James, just to lend another perspective to what the message is. And one other person that I'll throw in there is Carl Jung. And because here was a man who was a psychiatrist, but he was also very spiritual. When there was a great Time magazine article, and somebody just sent me a copy because I lost theirs. I think it came out in the 50s, and it was all about him and the great work that he had done in psychotherapy. And they asked him, do you believe in God? And he said, no, I don't believe there's a God. I know there's a God. He was going beyond belief. He was going to, I know. There is no dispute of that fact. And so all throughout his practice, he was interested in spirituality as an essential part of the human being, and that was what he was trying to cause in Roland, was a spiritual transformation, which he failed. And so he sent him on his way, admonishing him to look for a spiritual way, and he found the Oxford group, and had some success, but at least he passed it on to Ebbe, as we already found out about. But it was later on, and I find this fascinating, in the exchange of letters between Bill Wilson and Carl Jung, right before Carl Jung died, when Bill wrote him to tell him about AA and how he had been so instrumental in starting this chain of events. And Dr. Jung was so happy to hear about it. And he expressed that in his letter. But in the second half of his letter, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, he went on to just make an observation about human beings in general. And it went something like this. He said, "It's my observation that each human being has to struggle in their life against evil." Now, we would say against character defects. But there's this power that's trying to work against us in our own best interests. And he said, and they always lose. And they always lose. With one exception. Now here we go again. With one exception. People who have had a profound spiritual awakening. But even that won't suffice. That is a necessary ingredient. The second thing that is necessary is they have to be in a society that helps them maintain that condition. Does that sound like AA? Does that sound like AA? So even when you have a hot flash like Bill had, that's not my name, that's what he called it himself. He said, my hot flash. And you have this incredible personality change. And as Tom said, contained in that ball of energy is the freedom from alcohol and this sense of being in touch with your own creator. And coupled with that, a desire to share it. They go together. That if you have a spiritual awakening, you can't help wanting to pass it on. There is no admonition, don't forget you're responsible and get out there and help somebody. You don't have to tell that person that. They can't help themselves from wanting to go out and pass this on. But that energy itself will not stay at that level. It'll start to fade. And it starts to fade. And that's where the society of alcohol, or a spiritual society, is necessary to help maintain that, so that we can come and help each other maintain that connection with our own creators, with God, with higher power, whatever we want to call it. And so we find this historical background of various forces making suggestions, making changes to the basic message itself. And eventually there came the day that Bill dreaded as he wrote the big book. He wrote about himself, and he wrote more about alcoholism, and he wrote working with others, and he wrote, but he didn't want to write how it works. Because he knew when he brought that, when he attempted to put down specifically what we were doing, because it was being done by word of mouth in different parts around the country, and as we said, yeah, I tell you, and then you tell them. Well, it doesn't even sound like what I told you, because you went over there.